to invite and have agreed to come Professor So-Young Kim from the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy at KAIST, which is, I think it's the #1 university in Korea. But this graduate school is a great English-based graduate program that covers a lot of the different aspects of policy analysis, policy study that I think we are striving for in the Department of Social Sciences. So I want to introduce Professor Kim, and then I will turn it over to her. She was trained as a political scientist and has led a number of large-scale research projects on high-stake issues falling at the interface of science and technology and public policy. This includes government R&D funding, evaluation, governance of emerging technologies, big basic science policy, science and engineering workforce, and science-based ODA. As a public intellectual, she has also served on a number of advisory committees at the local, national, and international levels, including the World Economic Forum, and has lately chaired the Spent Nuclear Fuel Policy Review Committee of the South Korean government that deals with one of the most serious and challenging science and technology policy issues for South Korea. We're so happy that you're here, and we're so grateful that you could spend your time, and appreciate you waking up so early to speak with us. She comes to us from Daejeon, South Korea. Please help me welcome Professor Kim.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very, very generous introduction. Speaking about my own experience at KAIST, handling very difficult issues of science and technology policy, I've come to realize that this might not be really helpful for people trying to pursue a career, academic career, I'm saying academic career, but rather maybe as a social scientists, social science students or professionals here at IIT and also KAIST, which are both more or less SNT-oriented institution, I guess it could be helpful for anybody just interested in how things really unfold in SNT issues, especially for people like us who happen to be working or studying or teaching at an institution like IIT or KAIST. So I titled my talk as a political scientist. I'm trained in political science, so maybe it could be said also as a social scientist, whatever, but a political scientist adventure in a very strange world of science and technology, which I haven't ever thought about really working in. So I organized my talks into 4 stuffs. One about my own identity. As I said, I was trained in political science, and also my initial career was strictly political science related field. So from my own education in undergraduate and graduate years, and also landing at the first job, I haven't really thought about working in this area of science and technology policy. And this is my favorite capture from my own magnet. You have probably have seen this magnet from Alice in Wonderland, but this really represents my own trajectory over the last 15 years at KAIST. So I arrived at KAIST as one of the 2 founding faculty members for this School of Science and Technology Policy. But then after spending a few years launching the program and also really establishing myself at the institution, I've come to be engaged in many projects, and these are just some of the projects I have been involved at KAIST. So since 2014, so now it's become almost 10 years. I've been working as a project coordinator for the Kenya Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, which happens to be actually the same acronym. We call the Kenya KAIST, and there it's quite it's a lot much advertised in the nation and also abroad. So if you type this, you may find some ad or some news about this. And also, I've been now chairing the center called Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which was created out of the collaboration between the World Economic Forum and the Korean government. Although it's housed at KAIST, it's actually a national center, and we also have very nice website. And last year, I chaired the committee created to publish the 50th year of our institution. And our 50th anniversary was last year. So 2020 meaning last year. So last 2021, we celebrated our 50th year anniversary. But just very briefly about KAIST, as Professor Shapiro just introduced, it's the first-rate university in South Korea. In fact, it was established as the first research intensive university. And at the time, now we have an undergraduate program, but at the time it was only graduate school, admitting the best talents from the nation. And there are many, many achievements, especially first achievement in South Korean science and technology, including the first internet, first satellite, first supercomputer, and even in 1997. Now we all talk about AI revolution, but at the time we also created the first AI center. And even in terms of institutional stuff, not necessarily SNT, we also introduced the first tenure system, American style tenure system, and also we are the first university introducing English only education and research in Korea. And now many universities are trying to kind of mimic our institutional reforms. And also we produced the first astronaut. But in short, KAIST is a very, very small school. Every year we admit only 800, roughly 800 undergraduate students, and most of them are sort of science geniuses graduating from what's called the science gifted schools. And now we are our graduates are comprising roughly 25% of all the R&D workforce of Samsung, as you know, Samsung, right? And this is a remarkable figure because we are a very, very tiny school. So in other words, much bigger schools like Seoul National University, I'm graduated from. This is also good university, much bigger, but still it's KAIST graduates who happen to account for a lot of shares in terms of Korean engineering faculty and also startups. And something like, what is that? Korean version of Google was also created by KAIST graduate. So this is a very unique institution, which is maybe why I was invited to work for many, many committees in the nation, including committees of Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Energy, and Ministry of Economy and Finance, which is like the National Treasury, and also Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also globally, I was invited to this committee of the Global Future Council on Technology Values and Policy. And also I'm still working on some projects within the World Economic Forum, and also these days some committees on within OECD. So let me introduce my own academic research interests, which I really have strived to couple with my current obligations at KAIST. So initially, my research interest was very much focused on the comparative study of government spending, more or less government size, because government size growth is one of the most interesting, intriguing empirical regularities in political science around the world, regardless of whether this is small, big, or advanced or developing country. In the post-war world, we have seen an enormous growth in government roles, and technically just the size of government expenditure. And political scientists and economists have provided a lot of conjectures about why this has been the case. So because of industrialization and also bureaucratic expansion, interest politics, we have so many interest groups giving all the demands for the government, and also electoral competition actually boosts that sort of dynamics and fiscal illusion. So the reality is it's not really growth, but rather the way we actually count the size. But then one very interesting cause is economic openness, which is related to what's called the compensation hypothesis. And the logic is essentially because the world has been seeing this growth of trade, many countries opening their borders, which made these countries, most of us, really vulnerable to all the external influences, which is also why government has actually increased its roles, because they wanted to protect their citizens from external shocks. But in this article, which I published in my international organization, just at the beginning of my work at KAIST, I questioned the link between openness and external volatility, because the volatility was the key cause leading to government spending. But then my own finding is it's not openness itself, rather the risk, the volatility, the variance of trade or terms of trade that actually has influenced the growth of government. But then I really had a hard time at the beginning of my work at KAIST, because it's an S&T-oriented university, and now I still had to pursue my own academic interests as the only political scientist at the institution. And now I kind of found a compromise, not necessarily in a bad sense, but in a more positive, creative sense. So I focused on just the spending for science and technology. And in this article, it was, although it was published in 2013, the work itself was done most of the time after the financial crisis in 2008. Although South Korea was not that much affected by this financial crisis, we had this huge crisis in the late 1990s, which we call the IMF crisis, because we had to undergo the structural adjustment in the late 1990s. But anyway, my interest was whether government spending really increases or not for this science and technology in times of economic downturns, because there are very interesting competing hypotheses about the effect of economic cycles on government spending for R&D, because R&D spending is not really very, very urgent, unlike welfare spending. So there are equally competing hypotheses. One is it's going to go down because it's not necessary, not urgent. But at the same time, the other hypothesis is, in fact, it could go up just exactly because of compensation logic. This very volatile time, government really steps in to compensate for potential loss of domestic actors. So in the end, the hypothesis I actually tested was a differential effect across two, actually three regimes of political economy. One, coordinated market economies like Germany or most of the continental European countries versus liberal market economies like the UK or the US. And then finally mixed market economies like South Korea. But then here, what I found was that there was very, very counter-cyclical pattern of government S&T spending and economic downturns. So at least for coordinated market economies that have witnessed this traditionally very strong government roles in the economy, have seen government actually increasing spending for S&T in economic downturns. And another research I was interested in the early years of KAIST here was climate change opinion, just because now we have been talking about climate change for many, many years. But one of my students coming from a very poor country asked me in one of my classes, and that really puzzled me, which was in the global warming climate change, it's more than 10 years or 15 years, but everyone talking about why this is so great challenge, a global challenge, why it's still remaining as a global change, even after many, many years of discussion global level or national level discussions, all these policy initiatives. And then I was quite intrigued by the question. And now looking reading news media articles and also all these global conferences, my hunch was probably we were measuring public opinion just very in simplistic terms. Like, for instance, do you think climate change is a serious concern, serious issue? And now everybody says yes, because this is, I guess, climate change. Although initially we had this climate skeptics, and also we still have some skeptics, but still climate change has become almost like a normative issue, almost everywhere. So when you are asked whether this is an important question to tackle, almost nobody, right, answering, oh yeah, I don't know, I don't agree. This is almost like a normative question. So climate actions could be quite slow, although public support for climate change actions may be high. So I tested kind of a distinction. It was my hypothesis. There is a very, very interesting distinction in public opinion between some general concerns about the issue versus real, sincere support. Meaning, if you are asked whether you are ready to sacrifice something in order to mitigate or not mitigate, but address climate change, we probably have a very different results, which was actually the case in this research published in Global Environmental Politics some years ago. So I actually extended that research to the study of renewable energy adoption in South Korea in the chapter published just last year. And there also the puzzle was a gap between really, really high level of renewable energy spending, R&D spending in South Korea. And here, as you might see, South Korea, especially in the last 2 decades, we have been really increasing government spending for renewable energy technology development quite much. We are probably, in relative terms, South Korea ranks probably first in research, development, and deployment spending for renewable energy. But then the reality is it's really small, but you can see over here, South Korea ranks the lowest in major OECD countries in renewables as percentage of total primary energy supply. So this is just a shocking contrast. On one hand, we spend so much to develop renewable energy technologies. On the other hand, the penetration of renewable energy is so low, and it seems the same kind of gap between really normative endorsement of renewable energy versus the actual level of support maybe underlies this gap. So probably the willingness to pay for renewable energy may be the reason. And indeed, this is kind of a meta-analysis. So for EU and the UK and other countries, willingness to pay for renewable energy is quite high. So here you see these estimated amounts and quite a lot for solar electricity, wind turbines. But in South Korea, there are some of the studies measuring the public citizen consumers' willingness to pay for renewable energy. Although these are not really comparable in a straightforward fashion, just because what is actually measured is a little bit different, like green electricity versus some more general stuff like renewable energy. But anyway, the figure is so low, almost like the level of China, not Japan, right? This is even in Japan, it's still small, $17. Anyway, that's the reality. And now, as I get more involved in science and technology issues, I also study to do research on more science and technology related research. So it's almost it's more or less interface of traditional social sciences and also more or less interdisciplinary social science, social science and technology studies or S&T sociology and things like that. So one of the studies I did was actually to look at the norms, what's called the Martonian norms, that are known to distinguish scientists from other professionals. These are abbreviated as QDOS, like communalism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. Like for instance, organized skepticism implying that somehow scientists are trained to doubt and doubt, which lead them to actually be more open to criticisms and also new findings and other aspects too. But there is a criticism that these norms are more or less a storybook image rather than the reality. So scientists, like politicians, are equally self-interested and motivated by non-scientific factors to pursue their research. And also the communalism, meaning the sharing of research outcomes, output. So we publish in journals which are based on open science norms. But these days we are increasingly observing that even basic scientists are patenting their findings, really protecting rather than opening their research. So these are also, this is a gap, right, between the so-called very common traditional norms that we believe to be adhered by social scientists versus the actual practices of science. So I created a kind of a framework to analyze why these norms can be generated or believed by scientists, maybe because of their training, and also there may be some demographic differences, and also there is some effect of recent experience. So I tested all these links, finding that indeed scientists' endorsement of Mortonian norms are not quite pervasive. There are many interesting influences of recent experiences. And also, this is a regression analysis, but when you look at only descriptive result, we find very interesting contrast between age, in terms of age and gender. And another research I was interested in, actually this is related to some of the projects I was commissioned to do, commissioned by the National Research Foundation. And here we have a very well-known spectrum of science, one seeking very fundamental knowledge versus the other extreme being the pursuit of applied I mean inventions and innovations, technological innovations. But then in this book, which was also written by a political scientist, Donald Stokes in 1997, he actually transformed this one-dimensional spectrum into two-dimensional framework, so that we came to understand very, very true sense, right? But what I'm saying is we don't have only basic versus applied research, but in fact, we could have some mixture of the two, so that in this two-dimensional picture, you can have what's called use-inspired basic research. So the typical example is Pastor's research, which is very, very classic example of this use-inspired basic research. On one hand, he contributed to establishing a germ theory, which is just basic science, very fundamental knowledge. But then he also happened to create vaccines, right? So this is both the use and understanding. So sorry for this Korean. I'm going to show a little bit of Korean stuff later, but still, this is the very research I was commissioned to do, and the request was to identify very promising areas of research that South Korea has to focus on in basic science. So for technologies, more or less, these are very straightforward. We have semiconductors or quantum computing, very advanced AI, stuff like that. So South Korea government is very, very capable of identifying certain technological stuffs to promote. But for basic research, which provides almost nothing, in the short run, it's quite hard to find or identify areas of promotion for the government. So the request was to really find certain so the explicit demand was to identify, say, 30 or 40 initially, but I really hated this number, like 40, 30, 25. This seems to be too artificial, right? Based on certain analysis, you may end up identifying, say, 31 or 24, not necessarily in terms of 0 and 5. So in the end, government officials kind of conceded that this didn't need to be exactly 40 or 45. But one interesting example from that report was the category or field of research area called the optogenetics. And this is very, very, right now, it's kind of very well known research area here and also in advanced countries using light to manipulate neurons. But then here, what I did was, in order to identify, actually, in order to establish some research or some analytical framework, I used pattern analysis and also Google Trends analysis and also documentary analysis of the existing policy work and also comparing strengths across countries for this field. But anyway, so the phosphorus quadrant for South Korea was relatively narrow. It was 31 areas. Anyway, the next, well, this one is a little bit different. And I guess some of you, I mean, maybe many of you might be now wondering, wow, this person doesn't have a focus. She is doing everything here and there, but the focus is, as I said, I was trained in political science. And then now all the stuff I learned during my graduate training and early years of professional work in political science, I was trying to couple some of the interesting theories or phenomena with my own experience at KAIST. And this study of Asian values, and Asian values are usually categorized into four: of feminism, filial piety, communitarianism, and work ethic. I try to couple some of my understanding of existing political science concepts or theories or issues with my own experience, right, as a professional in a science-oriented university. So I wrote this article in 2010. So it was actually initially motivated by certain the debate on Asian values in the late 1990s. So this is the article. So my conclusion was the actual empirical tests show the reality is a little more mixed. So for instance, do Asians really, we are more working. So we have this stereotype image of Asians really working hard, kind of model minorities, say in the US. And these are not necessarily true. And even in Asia, East Asians within Asia, which are believed to have stronger Asian values, even East Asians may not necessarily have certain Asian values more strongly than other sub-regions, citizens of sub-regions like Southeast Asia. So more recently, so the research was done almost 10 years ago, but now I'm working on this research, really bring back the debate on Asian values, and now trying to use that as a lens to understand the interesting differences in COVID-19 responses. So early months of 2020, that was actually, this figure was from April 2020. And now we see Asians, right? Asians are wearing masks more voluntarily. And anyway, this is an interesting difference, regional difference. And the research was whether we are more willing to accept government controls. So there was a study actually comparing government response stringency in the first 3 days after the first COVID-19 case. And indeed, Asian governments are much stricter in enforcing certain quarantines. And also in terms of tracing, we have been doing contact tracing since the beginning of COVID-19. And contact tracing, as you know, is very controversial issue. And indeed, digital contact tracing, which was introduced as a complement to manual contact tracing. Now, the question is it because of values or because of systems? And it happens to be East Asian countries that are most reliant on digital contact tracing. So on one hand, a hypothesis could be maybe we are, ICT, East Asian countries are the countries with the highest rates of internet penetration and fastest internet, and we are using 5G and maybe even 6G is going to be the most common in East Asian countries soon, maybe before advanced countries. But anyway, the point is it because we have been promoting ICT much faster, much better than other countries? That is why we are quick to adopt digital tracing. Or maybe or is it because we are very much willing to follow government, follow the government? Like as you see, Asian values, one of the Asian values is collectivism, communitarianism, that is sacrificing freedom for collective security, and also deference to the elderly or the authority. So that's one interesting thing to check. And also the other interesting thing to look at is the implications, right? So now South Korea these days, initially we were quite successful, and we named that as K quarantine, like K-pop. K quarantine meaning we are so perfect in contact tracing. It's not only just tracing whether you have been contacted, but initially the government used what is that, credit card transaction records. This is so shocking to maybe you Americans, but anyway, so this is going to have very big implication for what's called the surveillance capitalism or digital authoritarianism. And now like China, probably South Korean government is following the steps of China, maybe because we are relying so much on digital technologies to create more or less in an unobserved or unintended way all these surveillance mechanisms. Anyway, so very recently, last year at EPSA, I just wrote a paper for a title, Half Open Pandora's Box. And there, indeed, I found 4 features of digital contact tracing, technological designs of digital contact tracing are very closely related to political variables like regime characteristics, including constraints on the executives, like that. Okay, so finally, I'd like to very briefly, I don't know how brief this could be, but I'm just checking the time. But let me go very quickly. So as I said, I was invited to many committees in the government, and the biggest one, I guess, was the Spain Nuclear Fuel Policy Review Committee, which I happened to chair. That was run for 21 or 4 months. So spent nuclear fuel issue is usually called the wicked problem, and wicked problem is something very complex technically and also politically, because the public consent on the importance of this issue is contested. I mean, the importance is agreed upon, but whether we should really devote our attention, public resources, on resolving this issue right away. And the other dimension is knowledge, whether we have technical, scientific knowledge to address the question. But spent nuclear fuel is not only a challenge for South Korea, but for many other countries which are relying on nuclear energy, right? So there are many interesting papers why nuclear risks are perceived very systematically. So very systematic difference between experts and ordinary citizens, and also famous sociological work on why high-risk systems are hard to handle because of these features, and why it's so difficult to create a governance for high-risk systems. So I chaired this committee for 21 months, although it was planned to finish by just in 6 months because of all these demonstrations and protests. And you see me here, I guess I was almost squeezed to death at the time. And I was escorted to somewhere by all these police officers, but still quite difficult time. And the key issue was whether we really want to make final decision about where to store nuclear fuel, spent fuel, and also where that site is going to be. And so the tree of decision was whether we like to really make final decision, and then if we really want that, we're going to have some temporary facilities, because finding the final site for spent nuclear fuel disposal is extremely difficult. There are only 2 countries which actually have completed this task of finding sites, Sweden and Finland. So this is a big challenge. But in the end, what we found is through public deliberation nationwide, we found most citizens, roughly 64%, agreed that we need kind of a centralized location where we store spent nuclear fuel temporarily, and also build the permanent disposal
What
site.
were those 2 countries? It was Finland and what?
Finland and Sweden.
Sweden.
Sweden. But then what I noticed is this is the don't know responses, and over first, second, third, and fourth survey of this intensive public deliberation, at the last survey, there was virtually no one declining to answer. I guess this is a big thing, in fact, because initially, although this is small, 5% said no, don't know whether we should make final decision in this fashion or not. But this is kind of an interesting phenomenon of public deliberation, and that also was found in the earlier similar public deliberation committee on whether we are going to shut down nuclear reactors that were under construction at the beginning of this administration, because the current administration, which is going to sort of expire in just 20 days, because we are facing this national presidential election next month, March 9, and there one of the promises that the current president made was to shut down nuclear plants under construction. And the other work I am still involved in is to create or develop policy suggestions for emerging technologies, like what's called fourth industrial revolution technologies, meaning all these fancy stuffs like AI, blockchain, precision medicine, drones, and all these stuff. So it took roughly 3 years to establish this center. And although this is a house that KAIST, it's sort of a national center, and we produce a lot of reports like this. And very recently, last year, we worked with the National University of Singapore and also some science communication group in the UK. And we published this report titled Using AI to Support Healthcare Decisions, because this is very, very sensitive issue, whether we are going to use telemedicine, or digital healthcare. And healthcare is one of the most regulated policy areas in South Korea, probably like in other countries. And then finally, this has been, I guess this is my fate, probably, because when I first did the feasibility study for this Kenya KAIST project, I thought it would just run for maybe 2 or 3 years, but then now it's approaching almost 10 years. So the project was supported by the Korean Treasury as the Ministry of Economy and Finance. It's an official government loan to the Kenyan government. So the loan was made to create an SNT university in Kenya, like KAIST. So the rationale was KAIST was very instrumental in fast track modernization or industrialization of the country, because as you saw, the graduates of KAIST in the early years were the very people who really provided engineering expertise for South Korea's industrialization. So in this comparison, very dramatic, as you can see, we are just $1 less our GDP in 1961 compared to Kenya. But now the change is very dramatic, right? We have achieved this remarkable growth, and KAIST was very critical. Yeah. Likewise, Kenya probably is going to achieve a similar growth once they establish that sort of SNT university, which can provide indigenous science and technology capability, so that the funding itself is $95 million. And this is really kind of a turnkey project, building the whole campus as well as the curriculum. And then Kenya follows more or less the British system, so even universities very much British style, but this is going to be quite American style, like KAIST. KAIST was also created with ODA funding from the US, and in fact, USAID introduced KAIST, evaluated KAIST some years ago. This KAIST project was the most, it's not one of the, but it's the most successful project that the agency funded in the whole post-war period. And now this is going on. And initially I did the feasibility study. It's not just myself, it's a huge team. But now it is under this construction phase. And feasibility study is just a study, but now this is the phase of implementation, and a lot of work, right? So that's one of the tasks I'm involved in right now at within KAIST. But as I said, this is not just the KAIST project, but the official development aid project of the government. So anyway, that wraps my presentation of academic and public work. Finally,
Oh, wait,
just
I was.
oh,
I think,
time.
I think, I think, Soyoung, I think it would be a
I'm
good
done.
opportunity to just pause. You've given us so much to think about. And maybe there will be no questions, but I'd like to, given that we only have about 10 minutes at the most, at least on the normal clock.
Right. This is the end, so yeah.
Well, no, just hold on. I mean, maybe not. Does anyone want to ask any questions of Professor Kim regarding anything that she's talked about, which is a lot to think about? Any areas that jumped out? I'd like to open it up.
I have one question. Why Kenya?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, Africa, as you know, Africa is not a continent. In fact, it's 55 countries, right? So we have south, east, west doors, but usually the real Africa, or well, I shouldn't say that already, but usually combining just to sub-Saharan Africa, we have east to south, west, but West Africa is more or less a francophone region. In East Africa, they speak English, and then somehow Kenya has a lot of similarities to South Korea in terms of political history, actually, because the first founding father was more like our own founding president. And yeah, that's a good question, but somehow it was given. There are very interesting statistical comparisons between the two countries for the Korean Exim Bank provided to Kenya and also the Korean government, why they picked Kenya. There are many reasons.
Anyone else? So you mentioned the expert panel that you were involved with. I'm aware of this expert panel from the air pollution angle, and I know that there are, if it's the same thing, where they get a group of citizens and they get a group of experts and they try and communicate some of the content of this very technical of these very technical issues to try and understand what the people know and maybe gauge their political orientation or political conflict, salience of the issues. Can you, this is, to my knowledge, something that we don't have in the United States. Can you explain maybe a little bit more about this process for us, and also maybe how it came to be? Maybe you know more about this, because it seems like it just popped into existence not long ago, right?
Well, we usually go through what's called a consensus conference or citizens jury. That's sort of a process to address policy challenges, especially for very technically complex challenges. And this is mostly because of social scientists who happen to be interested in technical risks, science and technology risks. So this has been institutionalized in the law, science and technology law in the country. And there is a specific clause mandating the government to go through this process when they handle a very controversial issue in S&T. So it's mostly environmental issues. So it's not just environmental impact assessment. It's a different thing, right? So, but then most of that process involves kind of education and deliberation for a certain designated period of time, in which both the pro and cons are presented, and citizens not only expressing their views right away, but they have to study the issue because it's technically complex. So, but then there is also criticism about the actual ways this process is handled, because it's not like several years or just a few months, but usually some weeks. And some people criticize that this is only very superficial process that the government use to add this kind of legitimacy to the final government decision rather than really truly participatory process. So that's somehow there is always criticism of whatever government does and what experts do. Right.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? Oh, Hal, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wondering, how do you, based on just your talking about, thanks for the great talk. So how do you identify the strategic basic research in the Korea?
How to
Identify strategic
ah,
research in Korea,
mhm.
in South Korea.
So there must be some framework and methodology. It's not going to be only based on expert views, but rather very meticulous scientometric method to be used in order to identify strategic research areas. Because that's what dividing the pie, right? So you have to have a very objective evidence to persuade not only the government but also scientists and engineers that their field may not be emerging or promising in the short run, but rather this field, some other alternative field will be given more support, right? So we used a lot of different techniques, as I said, the pattern and paper analysis, and also public surveys and other stuff.
Anyone else? Final chance? You said that contact, oh, someone's got their hand up. Yeah, I think, is that you, Jonathan?
Yeah, it is. It is. I just wanted, probably more of a short comment than a question, but reaction would be welcome. First of all, I love that you ended with that Douglas Adams quote. I think it just perfectly encapsulates what you hope to be an outcome of the kind of participatory processes that you're talking about. And I'm impressed by how what you described really reflects a lot of the thinking among environmental scholars about the requirements for stakeholder participation. And looking at the totality of the research that you presented, the idea that in order to really have an effective stakeholder participation process, there requires cultural sensitivity to get into areas of being able to integrate local and traditional knowledge, for example. So I'm really interested in how the Korean model translates to the Kenyan cultural context.
That's the challenge, in fact. So local knowledge and local technology, usually we look down, frankly speaking, the Koreans, I guess, look down upon sort of local stuffs there. And I say it's not necessarily local technology is kind of an inferior kind or quality, but rather, in fact, we have found recently that some of the local technologies, especially for construction, are much more suited to the purpose of certain technological and construction tasks. And also local culture is quite important because we don't want to simply put the American style institution there or KAIST itself there, but rather it's kind of Kenya's own institution. So even the name probably has to change in the end. And that's quite a challenge for people involved in this project, because as a political scientist and also taking all the classes during graduate program, and there's so much to learn about the delicate stuffs of ODA, but many of other colleagues in this project government officials or just engineers are not that much exposed to this sensitivity that sometimes we make errors and mistakes. Yeah, very bad.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think on that note, we're at time, and just it has been such a great opportunity for us to learn, all of us, including myself, to learn more about what you do, to learn about some of the most cutting edge methods and some of the, I don't know if eccentricities is the right word, but certainly unique ways that Korea approaches the science and technology related issues that certainly are important well beyond Korea. Can everyone please help me thank Professor Kim for coming? And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to her directly, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I hope that you stay all healthy and safe. I guess we are really approaching the end, I guess, right? Of COVID.
Well,
I mean, living
thank
with
you.
COVID.
We'll do our best. So it's funny that you mentioned that contact tracing works so well in Korea, but of course the numbers are astronomical, right? Over the last 2 weeks, it's gone from what, 5,000 per day to now 100,000 per day.
Right.
So contact tracing fails under those
It has
circumstances.
failed, yeah. In fact, government officially announced that it would not do tracing anymore.
Right? What's the point? It basically becomes impossible.
Right, yeah. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Again,
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye.
bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can leave. Thank you, everyone. Bye.